March 3, 1943, 0600 hours. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stands on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, watching 7 more warships shepherd 8 transports through waters the Imperial Japanese Navy has controlled for over a year. Below deck and packed into every transport hold, nearly 7,000 soldiers wait to reinforce the starving garrison at Lae. Kimura has no reason to doubt this crossing. His navy has never lost a convoy like this one. Not to submarines, not to torpedo planes, not to high-altitude bombers that always seem to miss. What Kimura cannot know, what no officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy could imagine, is that American mechanics working out of a rundown airfield in Australia have spent months turning ordinary bombers into something that has never existed in naval warfare before. Within 4 hours, that bridge beneath his feet will be shredded by gunfire, his own body torn by shrapnel, and by nightfall, of the 8 transport ships now cutting through these calm waters, not one will still be afloat. This is the story of how a handful of mechanics with wrenches and machine guns destroyed an empire's ability to resupply itself by sea, and why the men who survived it never forgot the sound of 8 guns firing at once. March 3, 1943, 0600 hours. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the open bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, feeling the cold spray of the Bismarck Sea against his face, watching the gray shapes of his convoy take formation around him in the pale pre-dawn light. 7 more destroyers ringed the 8 transport ships, a wall of steel that had protected Japanese shipping in these waters for more than a year. Kimura had commanded this kind of operation before. He knew the rhythm of it, the calculations, the confidence that came from experience. Somewhere behind him, in the holds of those 8 transports, nearly 7,000 men of the 51st Division sat crowded among crates of ammunition and sacks of rice. Men of the 115th Infantry Regiment and the 14th Field Artillery Regiment, waiting out the crossing to Lae, where Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi had been begging Rabaul for reinforcements for weeks. Kimura did not think of the men below as numbers. He had walked among them the night before the convoy sailed, watching young soldiers write final letters home by lantern light, watching older men clean rifles they had carried since Manchuria. He understood what was being asked of him: deliver 7,000 men and thousands of tons of supplies across 400 miles of water that American and Australian aircraft patrolled constantly. He believed he could do it, because the Imperial Japanese Navy had done it before, and because nothing in his experience suggested that this crossing would be different from the ones that came before it. That confidence was not arrogance. It was built on 2 years of hard evidence. Japanese destroyers had run this route from Rabaul to Lae and to Guadalcanal dozens of times, absorbing bombing runs that rarely found their mark. American B-17 flying fortresses dropped their bombs from 7,000 feet, giving ships ample time to see the fall of the payload and turn away from it. Torpedo planes needed long, straight approaches that made them easy targets for anti-aircraft gunners who had grown skilled at leading their shots. Kimura's own gun crews, hardened by the grinding campaign around Guadalcanal, had shot down or driven off more American aircraft than he could easily count. Japanese naval doctrine treated the sky as a threat that discipline and concentrated fire could manage. Nothing in that doctrine accounted for what was waiting for this convoy 4 hours away. 1,200 miles to the south, in a converted hangar at Eagle Farm Airfield outside Brisbane, Australia, a heavy-set American named Paul Gunn had spent the better part of a year trying to solve a problem that traditional military doctrine could not solve. The men who worked under him called him Pappy, a nickname he had earned partly for his age, past 40, well beyond the years of most combat flyers, and partly for the quiet, stubborn patience he brought to fixing things other men had given up on. Gunn had once flown for the Navy, and then for a commercial airline in the Philippines, before the war swallowed his old life whole. He had escaped Manila just ahead of the Japanese advance, flying evacuees out under fire, and he had arrived in Australia with nothing left to lose and an engineer's obsession with solving problems by hand. The problem in front of him was simple to state, and had defeated every attempt to solve it. American medium bombers could not hit moving Japanese ships. High-altitude bombing missed almost every time. Torpedo attacks required specialized air crews and equipment the Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific did not have. Ships kept sailing past American air power as though it barely existed, and every ship that got through meant more Japanese soldiers, more fuel, more ammunition arriving at fronts where American and Australian troops were fighting and dying in the jungle. Gunn believed the bomber itself was not the problem. The tactics were, working with a North American aviation technical representative named Jack Fox, Gunn began stripping the bombardier's position out of the nose of a B-25 Mitchell and packing the empty space with 50 caliber machine guns instead. First 4 of them, then 8, wired to fire together at the pilot's command. It was unglamorous work, done with hand tools in tropical heat, full of miscalculation and repair. The added weight of the guns and their ammunition threatened to throw the aircraft's balance off entirely, and Gunn's mechanics spent long nights shifting equipment fractions of an inch at a time until the modified bombers flew true again. The ammunition Gunn chose for those guns mattered as much as the guns themselves. Each 50 caliber round left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, an armor-piercing incendiary shell capable of punching through a destroyer's thin deck plating and setting fire to whatever it found on the other side. A single gun could fire 850 rounds in a minute. 8 guns firing together threw out nearly 7,000 rounds in that same minute, a solid stream of steel that no destroyer's thin gun shields or exposed gun crews could survive standing in front of. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force and had the authority to gamble on unconventional ideas, saw what Gunn had built and understood its purpose immediately. He called these modified aircraft commerce destroyers, and he paired Gunn's gun modifications with a second innovation developed separately by Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group. Benn had discovered that a bomb dropped from 250 feet, released at exactly the right speed and angle, would skip across the water's surface like a thrown stone before slamming into a ship's hull below the waterline. Pilots practiced the technique for months against the wreck of an old freighter near Port Moresby, learning to judge distance and timing until they could drop a bomb with the same certainty as a man rolling a bowling ball down a lane. By the first days of March 1943, the 3rd Attack Group had converted fully to this new configuration. The 90th Bombardment Squadron, led by a young major named Edward Larner, had drilled the tactic until it felt almost routine. Fly in low, drop to wave top height 2 miles out, open fire with all 8 nose guns at 1,200 yards. Hold the aircraft steady as the tracers reached out and found the target. Then release the bombs to skip home while the gunner in the tail sprayed whatever the nose guns had left standing. It was a tactic built entirely from failure and correction, born in a converted airplane hangar rather than in any pre-war manual, and not one Japanese officer anywhere in the Pacific had ever seen it used or prepared a defense against it. Rear Admiral Kimura knew none of this as his convoy pushed east through the Bismarck Sea that morning. He knew only the world his experience had taught him to expect, a world where Japanese destroyers with disciplined gun crews could weather anything American air power had shown them so far. His lookout scanned the horizon out of habit more than fear. Commander Sugawara, captain of the Shirayuki, moved along his own bridge, checking that every gun position was manned and ready, the same routine he had run a dozen times before without serious incident. Neither man could see the 12 B-25 Mitchells and 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters already airborne to the south, flying low enough that their propeller wash kicked up spray from the ocean's surface, closing the distance toward a convoy that still believed it understood the shape of the danger ahead of it. Nor could they see the formation of B-17s approaching separately at 7,000 feet, flying the kind of familiar, survivable attack that Japanese gunners had grown confident handling, an attack that was never meant to sink a single ship. It was meant only to pull every Japanese eye and every anti-aircraft barrel skyward, so that when the real attack arrived at wave-top height, it would arrive as something the Imperial Japanese Navy had never trained for, never imagined, and had no doctrine left to answer. Below the Shirayuki's weather deck, the smell of diesel and salt hung thick in the passageways, mixing with the sweat of men packed too tightly into steel compartments, never designed to hold soldiers for days at a time. In the transport holds, young privates sat shoulder to shoulder on their packs, listening to the groan of the hull and the steady thrum of the engines, some sleeping upright out of exhaustion, others staring at nothing, thinking of villages and families thousands of miles away. A few of the older sergeants passed around cigarettes and told quiet jokes to steady the younger men's nerves, the same way soldiers had done in every army since armies existed. None of them could hear the ocean above the noise of the ship, and none of them had any reason to imagine that the calm gray water outside the hull would, within hours, become the last thing many of them would ever see. At Leh itself, 400 miles to the west, General Adachi walked the perimeter of a garrison that had been living on quarter rations for weeks, watching his men grow thinner and sicker with each passing day, and he had sent message after message to Rabaul asking when the promised reinforcements would finally arrive. He had no way of knowing that the convoy carrying his answer was already at sea, and no way of knowing that the men aboard it would never reach him in the numbers he so desperately needed. Gunn's own path to that hangar in Brisbane had been anything but simple. Months earlier, as Japanese forces closed in on Manila, he had flown transport aircraft out of the doomed city, loaded far past capacity with American and Filipino evacuees, dodging fighters and flying through weather no sane pilot would have chosen, landing on strips that came under fire almost as soon as his wheels touched down. He had left behind a wife and children trapped under Japanese occupation, a fact he rarely spoke about, but one that colleagues said explained the grim, tireless energy he brought to his workshop every single day. Men who worked beside him remembered him arriving before dawn and staying long after the rest of the crew had gone to sleep, running his hands along a half-finished gun mount as though the next adjustment might be the one that finally worked. The practice missions against the wrecked freighter near Port Moresby were themselves brutal lessons in patience. Pilots flew the same approach again and again, watching their first attempts sail high over the wreck or plunge straight into the water without skipping at all, adjusting their altitude by only a few feet at a time, their airspeed by only a few knots, until the failures slowly turned into something closer to certainty. Ground crews reloaded practice bombs under the beating tropical sun, keeping tallies of every run, and slowly a technique that had existed only as a theory on paper became a skill that young pilots barely out of flight school could perform, with their eyes narrowed in concentration and their hands steady on the controls. Kimura lowered his binoculars and gave the order to hold formation and increase speed toward Leh. 4 hours remained before the world he understood would end, and he spent them believing, as every officer under his command believed, that this crossing would be no different from all the ones that came before. At 0930 hours, the first aircraft appeared on the northern horizon, exactly where Rear Admiral Kimura's lookouts expected trouble to come from. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses climbed into view at 7,000 feet, their engines a distant drone against the pale morning sky, and every gun crew on every ship in the convoy turned their weapons upward, in a motion so practiced it barely required an order. This was the attack Kimura had trained his men to survive. High, slow, predictable, the kind of bombing run that Japanese anti-aircraft fire had swatted aside more times than anyone aboard could count. Commander Sugawara watched from the Shirayuki's bridge as the destroyer's gun crews began their calculations, tracking the bombers, calling out ranges, adjusting their aim with the calm precision of men who had done this many times before. Tracers began climbing into the sky in long white lines, and for a moment the entire convoy's attention narrowed to that single point of danger overhead. Below decks, soldiers who had grown used to the sound of distant bombing runs felt the ship's guns open up and allowed themselves a small measure of relief. the same relief they had felt every other time an American bomber had appeared and failed to do any real damage. A few men climbed halfway up companionway ladders to watch through open hatches, curious rather than afraid, certain that this attack would end the way every other one had. It was exactly what the attack was designed to do. While 7,000 feet above the water, every Japanese eye watched bombs begin to fall, and while every gun barrel in the convoy pointed toward the sky, 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 90th Bombardment Squadron and 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters of 30 Squadron came in from the opposite direction at a height of barely 50 feet, so low that the wash from their propellers kicked spray off the surface of the sea behind them. None of the lookouts stationed along the convoy's southern flank thought to search that low, since 2 years of war had taught them that aircraft attacking ships came from above, not from the surface of the ocean itself. Major Edward Larner led the B-25s in his aircraft, throttles pushed fully forward, watching the Shirayuki grow larger in his windscreen with every second. He had rehearsed this approach dozens of times against a wrecked freighter near Port Moresby, but nothing in that practice had prepared him for the strange stillness of the moment, the sense of closing on a target that had no idea he existed. The engines roared at full power just above the wave crests, close enough that spray occasionally spattered against the windscreen, and every man aboard understood that a single mistake in altitude, a single moment of inattention, would put them into the sea as surely as any Japanese gun could. Larner held his course steady, watching the destroyer's silhouette fill more and more of his forward view, waiting for the range to close to the exact distance his training told him would give the guns their greatest effect. At 2 miles out, he dropped to wave top height. At 1,200 yards, he opened fire. 8 machine guns fired together from the nose of Larner's aircraft, throwing nearly 7,000 rounds a minute across the water toward the Shirayuki's bridge. The tracers formed a solid, glowing line between his aircraft and the ship, and within seconds that line found its target. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the bridge windows in showers of glass and shattered steel, ripping through the thin plating that had never been designed to stop anything heavier than shell fragments. Commander Sugawara felt the deck shudder beneath him as the gunfire swept across the bridge, and in the space of a few seconds nearly every man standing near him fell. Kimura, standing only a few feet away, was thrown against the bridge railing as shrapnel and splinters tore into his side. He did not fall, but he could no longer stand without support, and the blood soaking through his uniform told him, even before the pain fully registered, that he had been badly wounded. The gunfire alone might not have finished the Shirayuki, but Larner's bombs did. Released in the same pass at exactly the right height and speed, they struck the water and skipped forward like flat stones thrown across a pond, closing the last stretch of distance in a heartbeat before slamming into the destroyer's hull below the waterline. One bomb found its way into the aft magazine. The explosion that followed tore through the ship's stern with a violence that no amount of training could have prepared her crew for, snapping the hull structure and severing the stern from the rest of the vessel in a single catastrophic instant. 32 men died in that explosion alone, and the Shirayuki began settling by the stern almost immediately, black smoke pouring from her ruined superstructure as fires spread through compartments that no one remained alive to fight. Kimura, bleeding and barely able to stand, understood in that moment that everything he had believed about this crossing was wrong. There was no time to give new orders, no doctrine to fall back on, only the immediate necessity of survival. Around him, the Shirayuki continued to settle deeper by the stern, smoke pouring from compartments where fire crews, who might once have fought the flames, now lay among the dead. Sailors who had survived the initial burst of gunfire worked frantically to launch what boats remained undamaged, aware that the ship beneath their feet had only minutes left before the sea claimed her entirely. Sailors carried Kimura from the wrecked bridge as the destroyer Shikanami closed alongside to take on survivors, and among those pulled from the water and the burning wreckage was Commander Sugawara himself, wounded but alive, one of the few men from that bridge who would live to describe what had happened in the first 90 seconds of the attack. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25s fanned out across the convoy, each pilot selecting a target from the chaos spreading across the water. The destroyers Asashio, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Tokitsukaze all found themselves under fire within moments of the Shirayuki's crippling. Their gun crews still turned skyward toward the B-17s when the real danger arrived at deck level. Japanese sailors who had spent 2 years mastering the rhythm of high-altitude bombing attacks found themselves facing something their training had never addressed. Aircraft close enough to see the faces of the men flying them. Guns that fired not in single well-spaced rounds but in continuous streams that swept across open decks and gun positions with the same effect as a scythe moving through wheat. Aboard Tokitsukaze, gun crews who had drilled for months to concentrate their fire on approaching aircraft found their carefully rehearsed procedures useless against attackers who were already inside the range where those procedures applied before anyone had finished shouting the order to fire. A young gunner standing at one of the destroyer's forward mounts had just enough time to see the B-25 bearing down on him, its nose flickering with muzzle flashes, before rounds tore through the gun shield in front of him. Men further aft, still facing skyward toward the B-17s, felt the ship shudder under the impact of gunfire before most of them understood an attack from the surface was even underway. Aboard Uranami and Asashio, officers shouted orders to redirect fire toward the low-flying attackers, but the B-25s crossed each ship's field of view in only a few seconds, too fast for gun crews trained against slower, higher targets to properly track. The 13 Beaufighters of 30 Squadron added a second wave of devastation, sweeping in low with their 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns trained on bridges and exposed gun crews. The squadron's crews had trained for exactly this kind of low approach, coming in from the front of each ship to put its bridge out of action before the transports or their remaining escorts could organize any coherent defense. Navigator Fred Cassidy, flying in one of 30 Squadron's aircraft, would later describe the attack as something closer to an execution than a battle, watching Japanese anti-aircraft positions fall silent, one after another, as cannon fire found gun crews who had nowhere to take cover. Cassidy and the other crews of 30 Squadron had flown the Beaufighter long enough to trust the aircraft's quiet approach, an engine note soft enough that Japanese sailors sometimes failed to notice the aircraft until cannon fire was already tearing into their positions, a trait that had already earned the Beaufighter its reputation among Japanese crews elsewhere in the Pacific as a machine that seemed to arrive without warning. The convoy's Japanese commanders, still expecting the kind of torpedo bomber attack their doctrine had prepared them for, ordered several ships to turn broadside toward the incoming aircraft, a maneuver that would have been sound against torpedoes launched from a distance, but which instead presented the attacking Beaufighters and B-25s with wide, unmissable targets running the full length of each hull. Officers shouting those orders from open bridges had no way of knowing that the aircraft closing on them were not carrying torpedoes at all, and by the time the mistake became obvious, the guns and cannons already tearing into their exposed decks had made the error impossible to correct. Men who might have survived a torpedo attack by holding a narrow bow on approach instead found their entire length exposed to gunfire that swept from stem to stern in a single pass. Aboard the transports, the effect of the attack was even more catastrophic than among the destroyers, since the transport ships carried none of the destroyer's concentrated anti-aircraft armament and depended entirely on the escort screen for protection. The convoy's 6 Army troopships, Io Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taime Maru, and Teo Maru, along with the fuel transport Kembu Maru and the naval auxiliary Nojima, carrying 400 Marines, had already lost the protective advantage of the escort screen once the destroyers themselves came under attack. One vessel after another took hits from strafing runs that tore through wheelhouses and cargo handling equipment before skip bombs found their hulls at the waterline. Bombs fitted with delayed fuses penetrated the thin steel plating of the transport hulls before detonating deep inside, opening compartments where soldiers of the 51st Division were still crowded together exactly as they had been throughout the crossing. Kyokusei Maru, carrying 1,200 Army troops in her holds, took hits that opened her hull below the waterline within minutes of the attack's opening moments. Water poured into compartments packed with men who had no clear route to open deck, and officers who tried to organize an orderly evacuation found the passageways already jammed with soldiers pushing toward ladders that could only accommodate a handful of men at a time. A young private who had spent the crossing writing a letter to his mother felt the deck tilt beneath him and understood, in the space of a few seconds, that there would be no time to finish it. Men who had been calm and orderly only minutes earlier began shouting over one another in the darkness of the lower holds, the ship's list growing steeper with every passing minute, until officers standing near the ladders could do nothing more than pull men through as quickly as the narrow opening allowed, knowing that for every soldier who made it to open deck, several more remained trapped below. Teo Maru, already damaged from a smaller air attack the previous day, had little reserve strength left to absorb further punishment, and fires that broke out in her forward holds spread quickly through cargo that included ammunition meant for the garrison at Leh. Her crew, still working to repair damage from the earlier attack when the main assault began, found themselves fighting two disasters at once, unable to fully contain either one before the ship's condition became hopeless. There was no time for orderly evacuation on any of the 6 troop ships. Ammunition stored in the same holds as the men began cooking off in secondary explosions, and fires spread through passageways faster than anyone trapped below decks could escape them. Soldiers who had spent the crossing talking quietly about home now found themselves fighting through smoke and rising water in the dark, many of them still wearing the full combat equipment they had been issued for the landing at Leh, weight that made swimming or even reaching a ladder nearly impossible for men unused to being submerged. The destroyer Aviation, one of the last escorts still capable of organized movement, took 3 direct bomb hits from a B-25 that her surviving crew would later remember only by the name painted on its nose, Chatterbox. The explosions tore through her upper works and damaged her steering gear so severely that her rudder jammed hard over, leaving her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, unable to bring his ship back under control. With her helm locked and her engines still driving her forward, Aviation collided with the transport Nojima, the 2 vessels grinding together as fires that had already broken out on both ships began to spread between them. Sailors aboard Nojima felt the impact throw them against bulkheads and ladders even as they fought to control fires already burning from earlier strafing runs, and within minutes it became clear that neither vessel could be saved. Kuboki did not survive the attack. The destroyer Yukikaze came alongside long enough to take off 176 survivors from the tangled wreckage of the 2 ships, before both were left to burn, their crews scattered between the water and whatever boats could be lowered in time. The 400 Marines who had sailed aboard Nojima found themselves fighting the same desperate scramble toward open deck as the soldiers aboard the troop ships, their supposedly safer berth aboard a naval auxiliary offering no real protection once the ship became tangled with a burning destroyer. By this point in the attack, barely 10 minutes had passed since Larner's first burst of gunfire had found the Shirayuki's bridge. The convoy that had entered these waters as a disciplined formation of 16 ships moving in careful order had become a scattered field of burning hulls, each one fighting its own private battle against fire and flooding with no possibility of help from the others. Japanese gun crews who survived the first passes tried to redirect their fire toward the low-flying attackers, but the B-25s and bow fighters moved too fast and from too many directions at once, appearing and vanishing along the wave tops before most gunners could properly track them. Some crews kept firing anyway, standing at exposed positions because there was nothing else left to do, and many of them died at their guns rather than abandon them. For the men in the water, the ordeal did not end when their ships went under. American pilots, under strict orders to prevent any of the 51st Division soldiers from reaching Leh in fighting condition, continued strafing runs against lifeboats and rafts, a brutal necessity of the mission's purpose that Japanese survivors would remember with particular horror for the rest of their lives. Men who had escaped burning ships only to find themselves adrift in open water watched aircraft bank back toward them and understood that even the sea offered no real sanctuary from what was happening above it. By 09:45 hours, less than 15 minutes after the attack began, every transport in the convoy was sinking, in flames, or already gone beneath the surface, a scale of destruction that would have seemed impossible to any of the men aboard those ships only half an hour earlier. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers, the Shirayuki, the Arashio, and 2 others crippled beyond any hope of continuing the voyage, drifted helplessly among the wreckage, while the surviving destroyers, Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo, worked desperately to pull survivors from water thick with oil, debris, and the bodies of men who would never see Ley or Rabaul again. What had been, only an hour before, a disciplined formation moving with the confidence of 2 years of unbroken experience, was now a scattered field of fire and wreckage stretching for miles across the wide, open, and now burning surface of the sea. Rear Admiral Kimura, propped against a bulkhead aboard the Shikinami, with his wounds roughly bandaged, watched through a haze of pain and smoke as what remained of his convoy struggled to stay afloat around him. He had commanded convoys through these waters for 2 years without losing a single major engagement, and in less than an hour, that entire record of experience had been rendered meaningless. A staff officer knelt beside him, relaying what fragments of information could be gathered by signal lamp and radio from the surviving ships, and each report was worse than the one before it. Kimura listened without speaking for long stretches, his uniform stiff with drying blood, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he had believed about these waters only a few hours earlier. There was no order he could give that would undo what had already happened, no maneuver left to attempt, only the grim work of counting what remained and trying to save as many of the men in the water as the surviving ships could reach, before nightfall forced them to abandon the search and turn back toward Rabaul. The surviving destroyers moved slowly through water thick with oil, wreckage, and the bodies of men who would never see Ley or Rabaul again, their crews leaning over the rails with lines and cargo nets, pulling exhausted soldiers and sailors from the water one at a time. Some of the men they pulled aboard were too badly burned or too weakened by swallowed fuel oil to survive the journey back to port. Others clung to floating wreckage for hours, watching aircraft pass overhead and bracing themselves each time for another strafing run, uncertain whether the next engine noise they heard would bring rescue or more gunfire. The work of pulling survivors from the water continued for as long as daylight allowed, but everyone involved in it understood that for every man brought aboard, several more had already gone under, weighed down by combat equipment they had never had the chance to remove. Above the wreckage, Larner's B-25s and the Beaufighters of 30 Squadron turned south and began the flight back to their airfields, their fuel and ammunition nearly spent, their crews largely silent over the intercom in the particular quiet that settles over men who have just done something they know will be remembered. None of them yet fully understood what they had accomplished. They knew only that they had flown directly at an enemy convoy, opened fire at point-blank range, and watched ship after ship come apart beneath them in a way that no bombing mission any of them had flown before had ever managed. Gunners in the tail positions, who had spent the return flight watching the smoke rising behind them, found themselves unable to describe what they had seen in the ordinary language of a mission debrief, and more than one crew chief waiting on the tarmac at Port Moresby noticed how quiet the returning airmen were as they climbed down from their aircraft, men who usually joked and complained after a mission now saying very little at all. Word of the attack reached Rabaul within hours, carried by the fragmentary radio reports of destroyers still searching the water for survivors. Staff officers receiving those reports found the numbers difficult to accept. Entire transports simply gone, destroyers crippled or sunk, an escort commander wounded, and his flagship destroyed within the first minutes of an attack that Japanese doctrine had never considered possible. Behind the scattered wreckage and burning hulls, the Bismarck Sea was thick with smoke, and the men still struggling in the water had no way of knowing that what had just happened to them would be remembered, on both sides of the Pacific, as one of the most complete naval defeats of the entire war, and that the consequences of this single morning would reach far beyond the men and ships lost in it. By late afternoon on March 3rd, the surviving destroyers of Rear Admiral Kimura's shattered convoy had done everything the daylight hours would allow. Shikinami, Yukikaze, Uranami, and Asagumo moved slowly through drifting oil and wreckage, pulling aboard every man they could reach, before darkness and the renewed threat of air attack forced them to turn west toward Rabaul. The sea around them had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural after the noise of the morning, broken only by the creak of cargo nets hauling exhausted men over the rails and the low murmur of sailors calling out to anyone still conscious in the water nearby. Kimura himself lay in a cramped compartment aboard Shikinami, his shoulder and stomach wound roughly dressed by a medical orderly who had far more casualties to attend to than hands to treat them. He drifted in and out of a pain-dulled haze through the long return voyage, aware only in fragments of the ship's engines working beneath him and the occasional shudder as her crew maneuvered around debris still scattered across the water. He had commanded convoys through these waters for 2 years without a serious loss, and in the space of one morning that record had been erased entirely. The final accounting, compiled over the following days from the reports of every surviving ship, confirmed what Kimura had already understood from the deck of Shikinami. Of the roughly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division who had sailed from Rabaul, nearly 2,900 were dead, killed outright by gunfire and bombs or drowned in the flooded holds of their transports. Japanese destroyers and submarines arriving after nightfall managed to pull close to 3,800 more from the water, exhausted, burned, and coated in fuel oil, but nearly all of them were carried back to Rabaul rather than forward to Leh, their part in the campaign finished before it had truly begun. Of the entire convoy, only about 850 men eventually reached the garrison they had been sent to reinforce, a fraction so small that officers compiling the final report at Rabaul reportedly checked their arithmetic twice before submitting it, certain at first that a decimal point had been misplaced somewhere in the count. Every one of the 8 transport ships was gone. 4 of the 8 escorting destroyers, including Kimura's own flagship, lay on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea alongside them, and the water where the convoy had once sailed in careful formation was, for days afterward, still giving up bodies to the currents that carried them toward the New Guinea coast. For Lieutenant General Adachi, waiting at Leh with a garrison already reduced to quarter rations, the arithmetic of the disaster meant that the reinforcements he had been promised for weeks would never arrive in any strength capable of changing his situation. The 115th Infantry Regiment and 14th Field Artillery Regiment that had been meant to rebuild his defenses had been reduced, in a single morning, to a fraction of their intended strength. Adachi's men would fight on at Leh for another 6 months, but they would do it without the men, the ammunition, and the artillery that had gone down with the convoy, a shortage that would shape every decision made at Leh for the remainder of the campaign. The strategic shock of the battle reached far beyond the men directly involved in it. Word of the convoy's destruction traveled quickly through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy, carried first by radio reports and then by the survivors themselves as they were landed at Rabaul, men who described an attack that bore no resemblance to anything Japanese doctrine had prepared them to expect. Naval officers who had spent 2 years treating American air power as a manageable nuisance were forced to confront the fact that a force of modified medium bombers had destroyed an entire heavily escorted convoy in under 15 minutes, at the cost of only a handful of American and Australian aircraft. Commanders reviewing the action searched for a tactical response, some adjustment to formation or anti-aircraft procedure that might have changed the outcome, and found none that addressed the fundamental problem. There was no way to outmaneuver an aircraft that could see a ship's bridge from a few hundred yards away and put a continuous stream of half-inch rounds through it before any gun crew could properly respond. Some officers proposed adding still more anti-aircraft guns to every available deck space. Others argued for tighter formations that might concentrate defensive fire more effectively. But veterans of the battle who had watched the attack unfold at deck level understood that no amount of additional weaponry addressed the basic imbalance. A destroyer's guns, however numerous, still depended on human beings standing exposed behind thin shields to aim and fire them, and those men had proven no match for 8 machine guns, arriving low and fast with no warning at all. The consequence of that realization proved immediate and lasting. The Imperial Japanese Navy quietly abandoned the practice of running large daylight convoys of troop transports through waters within range of Allied airfields, a decision that solved the immediate problem of losing entire convoys but created a far larger one in its place. Without the capacity to move large numbers of men and heavy equipment by transport ship, Japanese garrisons throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were forced to depend on submarines and small, fast vessels that could only carry a fraction of what a single transport had once delivered in one voyage. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies that had once arrived in bulk now trickled in, when they arrived at all, and garrisons that had been stretched thin before the Bismarck Sea found themselves approaching outright starvation in the months that followed. At Lae itself, the shortage proved impossible to overcome. When Allied forces landed at Nassau Bay in June and pressed their offensive along the Huon Gulf coast that summer, the Japanese garrison, weakened by disease and lack of supply, had no reserves left to call on. By September 1943, with Lae no longer defensible, the surviving defenders were ordered to abandon the town and retreat overland across the Sarawak Mountains toward the northern coast, a route that climbed through terrain so high and cold that soldiers who had spent the war in tropical heat found themselves marching through snow they had never expected to see in New Guinea. Of roughly 8,600 men who began that retreat, some 2,200 did not survive it, lost to starvation, exhaustion, and disease on a mountain crossing that killed as effectively as any battle. Men who had survived years of combat in the jungle found themselves dying instead on frozen mountain trails, their bodies weakened past recovery by months of quarter rations that had never been replaced after the convoy went down. The men who died on that retreat were, in a very direct sense, casualties of the morning in the Bismarck Sea 6 months earlier, victims of a supply line that had been severed before it ever reached them. Their deaths, the delayed but direct consequence of 8 machine guns firing from the nose of a bomber they never saw, and a war they had no part in causing. Admiral Kimura himself recovered from his wounds within a matter of weeks, and rather than being quietly set aside after the worst defeat of his career, he was given command of the operation to withdraw the Japanese garrison from Kiska Island in the Aleutians that same July. When deteriorating weather threatened to strand men still waiting for evacuation, Kimura held his ships on station past the point his orders required, refusing to leave until the last soldier had been brought aboard, an act of stubborn discipline that stood in quiet contrast to the disaster he had survived months earlier. He went on to escort reinforcement convoys to the Philippines in 1944, and by the war's final year commanded a naval training school, surviving the conflict that had nearly killed him in the Bismarck Sea and living another 15 years afterward, eventually working in the salt industry in the peaceful decades that followed a war he had once nearly not survived. The aircraft that had done this to him did not disappear once the battle ended. Pappy Gun's 8-gun modification became the standard configuration for late-production B-25J bombers, with North American Aviation incorporating the field modifications directly into factory production. Strafer squadrons spread throughout the Southwest Pacific over the following 2 years, hunting Japanese shipping wherever it tried to move, striking harbors, anchorages, and eventually airfields, with the same combination of nose gunfire and skip bombing that had destroyed Kimura's convoy. Japanese naval officers writing after the war would describe the Strafer bomber as one of the technological shocks that made the war impossible to sustain, a weapon that had turned the simple act of moving supplies by sea into something no Japanese captain could do with any confidence of survival. What began as one mechanic's stubborn effort to solve a problem no one else could solve, working with hand tools in a converted Australian hangar, ended as one of the most significant tactical innovations of the entire Pacific War, a lineage of thought that military historians would later trace forward into the heavily armed gunship aircraft flown by American forces in conflicts fought decades after the guns of the Bismarck Sea went silent. Pappy Gunn himself never sought recognition for what his workshop had produced, continuing to fly and tinker with aircraft modifications for the remainder of the war, more interested in solving the next mechanical problem in front of him than in reflecting on the scale of what he had already changed. Rear Admiral Kimura had entered these waters on the morning of March 3, 1943, trusting 2 years of hard-won experience to guide him safely through. He left them 4 hours later, wounded and diminished, having learned in the most brutal way possible that experience is only useful until the day an enemy invents something it never accounted for, and that no navy, however proud its tradition, is ever truly safe from the men willing to solve an old problem in an entirely new way.